Hello and welcome to the last in our series of videos on an introduction to Java. Today we're going to be talking about methods. Now, methods are really just a neat way of grouping code together so that you can call it with just a name. And there's a lot of benefits to being able to do that. One is to just be able to organize your code. Rather than having your code in one big series, you can break it up into chunks, and therefore you can more easily test it, or if you need to make a change, you can change just that one method and know that the rest of the code is still going to work. Another thing is that you can use a method again and again and again. So rather than doing that horrible copy and pasting of code whenever you want to duplicate it somewhere, you can just call the name of the method and it will automatically jump to that code and run through it. The last reason is a little more complex and a little more nuanced. It's about hiding information. When you call a method, like let's say add, that method is going to perform work for you and you know what it's going to do, but how it does it is hidden. And that's actually a very powerful thing for computers, because you can then later change the implementation of that method and yet still not break the people who have been using that method. Now, methods are a type of structure that will basically halt the natural progression of the program. So if along this line, you can see this is the execution of a program. When you choose to call a method, it is going to stop that flow. It is going to jump over to the method, run the code inside that method, and then when that method is done, it returns back to that main flow of the program, and that continues. And then another method might get called, and it leaves that normal flow, executes the method code, and then returns back to that main flow. Now, this may sound a little bit strange, but you've actually been using methods all along, from day one, really, when you first started learning. And that's because a lot of methods have been provided by Java, right? When you think of the things that you want to do, you didn't have to start writing a bunch of code for reading in from the keyboard or for writing out. Instead, what you did was you used a method. Let me give you some examples of methods that you've learned. Print line, going out to the screen. Read int, length, to get the length of an array, for example. Character at. These are all examples of methods, code that somebody else, a developer, has written that you are able to use just by calling the name of it. There are lines and lines and lines and lines of code behind the ability to read an integer from the keyboard. But you don't need to worry about that. You just go ahead and call the method and it works. Methods have a few parts to them. And we're going to jump into a demo well, you know what? Let's jump into a demo right now. So here we have, actually, let's just take one step back. Let's look at the methods that you have used. So for example, the print line. So when you wanted to print something to the screen, you use this print line command. And it's just a name, it's a method, but in order for it to do its job, which is to print something in the screen, you did have to give it information. And sometimes when you create methods, they do require certain information in order to do their job. In the case of print line, you want to give it a string. And these things that we pass inside these brackets, they're called parameters. They're the data that the method needs in order to accomplish its task. Sometimes there might not be any parameters, like readInt. ReadInt didn't require a parameter, it just gave you back information. And sometimes you might need multiple pieces of data. So this might be an example of setting the size of a screen. And you're giving it an x coordinate, an x size, and a y size. Now, these things that are passed in can't just be anything. When you create a method, you have to specify what type of data you're going to get in. I want 2 integers for this, or I want 1 string for this. And when you call it, you have to conform to the data that it's expecting as parameters, or else an error will be spit out. The other piece is that methods can also give information back to you, which is really useful. Think about a method that adds 2 numbers. Well, that's fine and dandy, but you want to get that addition back as an answer to work with. And when a method gives back information to you, what ends up happening is that this method is called, and when it returns, this whole piece here becomes that return type, and you are able to take it and store it into a variable so that you can use it later on. And that's what you guys did when you read in from the keyboard. You read in from the keyboard, and then it gave back a piece of information, and you needed to store it. If you don't store it, it's gone, it's lost. It did all that work for nothing. Again, the return type has to match what this is giving back. I can't just change this to be something else like a string, because those data types don't match. The other thing is when you're using methods that have been written for you by someone else, one of the things that always comes along with these methods are what's called an API, which is basically documentation for the methods. When you use that context help in a development environment like NetBeans or Eclipse, it will actually kind of list those methods and give you some information, and it's grabbing that information from the API. And this API tells you whether it returns something and what it returns, what the method is called, and also whether it takes in any parameters. Lastly, before we get back to NetBeans, we talked about it being used for information hiding. And so that is a very important concept of being able to keep the implementation details hidden from the people who are actually using the method. So one more step before we head into NetBeans, and that is I want you to look at the one method that you've actually worked with and seen, and that is the main method. Most people ignore it because usually when I start teaching a Java course, I tell you, ignore it. That's just where the program starts. But in actual fact, main is a method. And you can see that it takes in a series of arguments, and these are arguments that come from the command line when the program is called. And you can see that it doesn't return anything. That's what this fancy word void is. Void means it's not returning anything back. These other things we're going to talk about in a second after I give you a few concrete examples of what you might want to do. So let's jump into NetBeans and go to create our first method. Now, unlike for loops or if statements, methods can't be nested. They all belong to the main class that you're working in. And so here you can see I've got my main method. If I want to create another method, it has to go either before or after this main method. So we're going to start it over here. And I'm going to type in public. I'm going to type in this keyword static that we'll explain later. And let's create a method that's just going to say hi. So it's not going to return anything. And let's call it say hello. Doesn't need any information in, and the only thing that I want this method to do is to print hello. Nice and easy. Now I could go and I could run my program, and sadly you will learn that nothing happens. And nothing happens because I've created this method, I've given it a name, but unless I actually call it or use it, nothing is going to happen. So if I want to actually use it, in here I have to actually call that method by name. And I could say hello and run it now, and it will actually print hello to the screen. So remember we talked about being able to reuse code, and that's one of the cool things about methods is that I can now just call it again and it will run that code. again a second time. Now, this is kind of a bit of a boring method. We want to add a bit more complexity to it. So the next thing that we talked about was being able to provide information into a method. So here's another method. I'm going to do something a little crazy. I'm going to give it the same name, but now I'm going to give it a parameter. And so now what we have is a method that is going to take in a single parameter, which is a string data type. And now to make it a little more personal and nice, we are going to say hello, and we're going to add the person's name into it. So what it's going to do is it's going to take the information given to it, and it is going to use it down here. Now that's a little bit crazy, seeing that I have two methods with the exact same name. How does Java know which one to actually call? And that's where these parameters come in. I can have methods of the same name as long as there's something to distinguish those two methods, so that Java knows which one to call. If I give it to it like this with nothing, it's going to call this first one. If I give it to it here with a name like Bob, it's going to know to come down to the second one. Okay, so let's try that. Let's throw in another hello and run. And there you go. You can see we have a slightly more complex method. And you can have as many methods as you want inside your code. And even though you can write methods, it doesn't necessarily mean that they're going to be the most useful methods that you can think of. Here's one that's just going to add two things together. And so we can call it, and I can call add, and I can give it numbers, and we can run it. Notice what's happening here, and this is probably one of the biggest pieces of confusion, is that this number 2 is going to be represented inside the method as a. That's what these parameters here mean, is that what these are saying is that you give me an integer, and inside this method, that integer is going to be referred to as a. These variable names are only referring to what's happening inside the method. And that's very confusing for some people. So for example, I could do int x equals 3, int y equals 20, add x, y. Where do x and y go inside this method? Well, x becomes a, and y becomes b. When you pass these things into the method, it's like making a copy. It's called passing by value. And so you're not actually changing the variables x and y in there. You know, if I said a equals 2 down here, this isn't going to actually change what's happening out here. What happens inside the method stays inside the method. Now there's a few ways to break that rule, and we'll kind of get to that a little bit later. But that's sort of a basic premise of methods in Java, is that it passes the information, it passes primitive data by value. So one last bit of kind of learning to do before we get into some complex subtleties, and that is this method is really kind of boring, because while it adds, it's really only printing it to the screen, and that might not be useful to me. That might not be what I want to get from it. What I might want is for it to actually add the two numbers and give me the result, so that I can then do other things with it. And that's where this return type comes in here. Remember we said that void means it's not returning anything. Well, if I wanted to actually give that value back, I could change that type to be, let's say, an integer. And what that means is this method has to give back a value. It does not have a choice. It has to give back a value. And that's why you can see NetBeans right away flipped out on me. And it flipped out on me because I haven't told it to return anything yet. And so most of the methods you use in Java don't actually print stuff to the screen. They just do work and return a value. So rather than printing it out, I'm going to return the value of a plus b. You'll notice now my code is all happy. it's still going to call these methods, but it's not actually going to print anything down here. And it's also not going to store it or use it. If I want to store the results of A plus B, I need to then create something. Let's make it X, and we'll get rid of this X down here. So here's another one. Int y equals. And then what I could do is I can take that and I can actually combine it together if I want. So I can combine a method within a method. The answer is, and we could put add of x and y. And so now when I go ahead and run this, there's craziness going on here. It's going to add 3 and 2, put it into x, add 4 and 5, put it into y, and then in here it's going to add those two together and spit out the answer of 14. And so you can see that methods can start to get really powerful very quickly. But all of the methods follow the same structure, right? They all happen inside the class. They can't be nested within each other. And they have to follow the same steps. What's it returning? What's its name? Does it have any parameters to it or not? So now let's get into a couple subtle pieces of information here. So one has to do with this return statement. The return statement is actually saying, let's exit the method, right? So that leaves the method and goes back to that main program execution. And so I cannot put any code after the return statement because it will never get executed. Everything in the method will go line by line, but once that return statement is there, it exits the method and goes back to the calling method. Okay, so that's one important point to keep in mind. The other important point is that while I can't declare a method inside a method, I can certainly use those methods. So for example, inside this add method, I could call say hello with the name John, and that's perfectly valid. And then when I go ahead and run it, every time that add method gets called, it's going to say hello John, hello John, hello John. And it said it 3 times because remember, I've called this add multiple times. Remember, add, 3 calls. So I'd be remiss if I didn't review and maybe at least explain some of these other keywords inside a method. The first one that I kind of ignored is this public. And public means that this method can be called from anywhere. It is public, which means that any other program, as long as it calls it correctly, can use this method. There are other things. There are methods that are private that are kind of hidden, or methods that are protected, which are kind of in between, the best of both worlds. Then you have this keyword static. And static means, remember that all programs exist inside a class, and we haven't really talked about what these blueprints are. But static means that you can just call this method directly from that main method. You don't need to worry about what class it's in. You don't need to worry about instantiating or using the class. It's just static. Later on, you're going to find some non-static methods which give you a bit more power in some instances, but can be a little more difficult to call, which is why everything right now is static. Then you have the return type, the name, and the parameters. Remember that one of the restrictions to methods is that it can only return one thing. I can't put multiple words here and expect it to return 2 doubles or 3 doubles. There are ways of getting around that, and we'll learn about those in the next series of lectures. But right now, that is a restriction. You can only return one thing. So the only question left really is, when should you use methods? And the answer is a lot, and in most cases. If you have code that logically hangs together, that does something, that's one candidate for moving it off to a method, giving it a name. If it's something that could theoretically be reused, you put it into a method and give it its name. If you want to organize your code logically, so think of a game that might have setup, might have a round, and might have a takedown or an end game. You might set those up into 3 different methods. If you then have the rolling of a dice happening inside that, you would again create a method to be able to handle that. So when you think of all the different functions or all the different steps, you naturally try to break it out into methods. And you should never have one single block of code that just goes on and on and on and on, when that code can be broken up into logical chunks that make sense. It helps with testing, it helps with organization. And so from this point on, as you're writing code, I really expect you to be thinking in the back of your head how to organize it, even before you start to write it. How are you going to organize it? And very often you'll end up creating some of those helper methods first before you even look at the bigger picture and try to put it all together. We talked a little bit about top-down versus bottom-up programming. Well, writing methods is that sort of bottom layer. So hopefully that helps a little bit in understanding a tricky but powerful concept in programming. In Java, they're called methods. Sometimes they're called functions in other programming languages, or sometimes they each have a slightly different meaning. Thank you. And if you have any questions, as always, you can send me an email or post a comment. Take care.